Well, welcome everybody to our online program on addiction recovery from the Sunshine Coast Health Center up here in Powell River, BC. And we've been talking about abstinence and this idea, this sort of big picture idea that abstinence is the solution to any problem with drugs or alcohol. So we're not talking about specific individuals here in the treatment that, for example, we would provide at the center to an alcoholic, but more generally, this idea that, well, drugs are bad, so just don't do drugs, just stop it. Right? And there was a very interesting interview done on television, a documentary. And the interviewer was asking a police officer if he was aware of the new research coming out on how to treat addiction and maybe even all the problems that the war on drugs have caused. And the police officer's response was that yes, he was aware of that, but his difficulty was that if he actually gave up this whole war on drugs idea, it would feel to him like he lost. That's the way he actually phrased it. It's like, we lost the war, which is actually kind of an interesting way of interpreting it. And so, because part of abstinence, and one of the ways it was always promoted, was to criminalize drug use, right? Alan Marlett, the late Alan Marlett, in his book on harm reduction, had talked about that most of the prisoners after 1988 in U.S. jails were there for drug-related offenses. And so this idea of criminalizing drug use was a very powerful tool that a lot of the people who thought, you know, drugs are bad, therefore don't do it, that they used in order to stop the drug use. But really, it turned it from a healthcare issue into this matter of criminal behavior. And so we have routinely now, for example, we have police officers sitting as experts on drug panels and things like that. And this idea of the criminal behavior is kind of interesting because it's created its own momentum now. So there are, for example, people who are very much afraid that if we were to decriminalize drug use, this would lead to all sorts of problems, right? And they talk about, just the floodgates would open, non-users would start using drugs, hospitals would be overflowing with all these drug addicts. And boy, time off at work, you know, everyone be phoning in Monday morning with the flu when actually they're just, stoned out of their minds. All of these fears that came up. And yet when we have real life examples, none of that became true. One of the more famous ones is Portugal, who in 2001 decriminalized all drugs and discovered that no more people were not using drugs. There was no problems. In fact, the exact opposite happened is illnesses went down, the number of deaths from drugs went down, crime went down, everything plummeted. And so generally, if you read the research, it's a wild success story. And in fact, even some researchers from the United States looking at this, who were not even sure they could pull off the Portugal experiment in the United States, even said one thing it did show was that all of these worries and these claims of disaster happening were actually quite ridiculous because it just didn't happen. And this idea then that if we were to not say, you know, drugs are bad, don't do drugs, if we were ever to say that, like in public, that somehow the average human being would take this as a permission to go get stoned all the time and things like that. So, and it's not based on all the evidence that we have to date. So again, it's kind of an interesting lesson about this nature of abstinence that we can learn from, for example, the Portugal experiment, that maybe if we didn't criminalize drugs, if we didn't stigmatize them, that it doesn't open the floodgates. Maybe, who knows, maybe like Portugal makes things a little better. At any rate, interesting things to think about. So we'll be back next time with another topic on our subject of addiction.